Hi, welcome to the How Do I video series on Microsoft Dynamics NAV 2015. My name is Mark Brummel and I'm an MVP for Microsoft Dynamics NAV and an evangelist for the Dynamics NAV Design Patterns project. I will be presenting how do I implement entries in Microsoft Dynamics NAV 2015. This video is made in collaboration with Plataan, a Microsoft Dynamics Learning Center from Belgium, and Microsoft. At the end of this video you will have an idea on how to implement entries in Microsoft Dynamics NAV. The objective of this video is to first look at the architecture of NAV and see where entries fit in. Then we will look at the design pattern from a standard application perspective. And lastly we will implement our own entries. But first let me explain what design patterns are. Design patterns are common solutions or best practices to solve problems. This is a well-known concept in computer programming and can therefore be applied to Dynamics NAV as well. This video is part of a series around design patterns in NAV, and during this video I will reference to other patterns and videos. To show this, we will be going through 3 easy steps. The first step, meet the pattern, we will look at how entries fit into the architecture. We will look at different types of entry tables and how the journal spine of NAV works. In step 2, know the pattern, we will discuss 4 different ways of working with entries in Dynamics NAV. In step 3, use the pattern, we will use the pattern in our own example application. I would like to reference to the other How Do I videos. How do I read and understand posting routines? How do I work with master data and posting? And how do I use the journal template batch line pattern? Before we dive into the programming, let's have a look at how the design pattern works in the application. In the layered approach that we discussed in the video, How Do I Read and Understand Posting Routines? The entries and detailed entries are at the lowest level. That is what this video is about. If we look in the application and search for table called entry something, we find about 66 instances, but they are not all the same. We can roughly divide them into 3 categories. First we have the most well-known entries, which are historical entries. They are not to be modified, delete for auditability, and they have registers that prove that there are no gaps in the numbering, meaning no entries are deleted. Typically we use detailed entries and application to update the data. The second category are temporary data buckets that are more or less free to be inserted, modified and deleted. There's no trace of deleted and modified data, and the entries are created without a journal or register. The last category are tables that are called entry but are not real entry tables according to the pattern. We will ignore those for this video. If we look at the pattern for an entry table, we have to fulfill 3 criteria. They have a primary key of either an integer or a big integer that is updated using auto increment or find last plus 1. They are used to summarize data based on fields such as source number, document number or dates. And they are called something entry or ledger entry. Ledger entry is only to be used when linked with bookkeeping. This is not nicely done in the standard application but should be followed anyway when creating your own. The most famous structure for entries in Microsoft Dynamics NAV is the journal spine that is the foundation for the application. This model is used in several other How Do I video series. This model is based on the journals as a contract to create entries. This is used for the first category of entry tables, where auditability is of the utmost importance. In this model, no data is modified or deleted, only added with traceability, give or take a few fields that are editable, such as putting a customer entry on hold. Dynamics NAV uses 10 instances of this model, which we can categorize by finding the register tables, which are an important part of this model, and the auditability. The entries are typically connected to master data and documents and can be traced using the Navigate API. In the next step we will discuss 4 ways of creating entries. Not all of these ways have the full traceability, and there are different methods of creating the entry records. For the first example, we will go back to the full traceable model. With this model, a single contract is responsible for creating the entries based on the master data. In this example, the contract is the general journal line. This journal can process GL accounts, customers, vendors, and bank accounts. Each time we post something, the entries are created and linked back to the other tables they belong to. Nothing in these entry tables should ever happen without going through the journal. This is the most essential model in Dynamics NAV from a financial perspective. Other journals have similar structures, such as item journals and resource journals. They are discussed in detail in the video How do I implement the journal template batch line pattern. The second method to create entries is used in the application for budgets and capacity calculation. Examples are financial and inventory budgets and resource capacity. If you look closely to this model, you hopefully notice that there's no code unit managing the data. This model uses a unique built-in mechanism in C-side that creates the entries based on flow fields and flow filters, using either buffer tables or even the master data itself. Let's see how that works from the application. The general ledger budget entries are created using the general ledger account budget buffer table. In our example, we start with an empty GL budget entry table. I've created a test code unit that has the GL account buffer table as a global variable. And in my code, the only thing I do is I set a filter on the budget, I set a filter on the GL account, and I set a filter on the date. Then all I do is validate the budgeted amount with a value of 100. If we go to the budget buffer and we go to the definition, we can see that the budgeted amount is actually a flow field. And the flow field has a definition of a sum with the budget name, the GL account number, and a whole list of flow fields you might recognize from the general ledger, and the date. And all the other fields, like the date filter, are flow filters. And there is no code in this table. So let us go ahead and close this code unit and run. And if we now go back to the budget entries and refresh, we can see that the system has created entry number 1 for GL account number 8000 with an amount of 100. This has all been done without any AL code, just using built-in mechanisms from C-side. If we now go back to our code unit and change the amount to 110, we save the code unit and we run it again. If we now refresh, we can see that Dynamics NAV has figured out the delta and added 10 to the amount. So now the total is 110. This is a unique built-in mechanism that only exists in Microsoft Dynamics NAV. In the next example, we will demonstrate the same using the resource capacity entry. We start again with an empty table, and then in the resource table we have a flow field called capacity. If we look at the properties of the flow field, we can see that it's a sum to the resource capacity entry with the resource number and the date as filters. We go to the resource card and we just simply add the field capacity to the resource, and we now run the resource card. We get the lift and we select to edit the data. We say that the capacity is 250. If we now look up the capacity, we can see that Dynamics NAV has created a record for 250. If we change this to 300, Dynamics NAV just adds 50, or we change it back to 200 and Dynamics NAV subtracts 100. This is all done without any code in the application. But remember, if you add a flow field to the GL entries, exactly the same mechanism starts working. So be careful with putting editable flow fields on any page, anywhere in Microsoft Dynamics NAV. Microsoft Dynamics NAV uses matrix pages that allow users to create the budgets and the capacity, using these flow fields and flow filters to create the entries. And users can delete entries anytime and start over. A third way of creating entry records in the database is used in relationship management. This module has 4 entry tables: interaction log entry, campaign entry, logged segment, and opportunity entry. All these entries are created using the seg management code unit that uses the segment line as a contract. The difference between this model and a general journal is auditability. End users have the possibility to change and delete entries in these tables. It's a different but very valid way of working with entry tables in Dynamics NAV. The last example is possibly the most intriguing entry table in Microsoft Dynamics NAV, the reservation entry. From all places in the application where inventory is used, we can reserve inventory. Each place, such as sales line, purchase line, or assembly header, has a code unit as an entry point. There are 14 of these code units in Dynamics NAV, and if you want to add reservations to your own add-on, you should create one for yourself. These code units then call into reservation management and reservation engine management, that then calls a generic routine that generates the data. Reservation entries cannot be modified or deleted by users like in relationship management, but they are changed and deleted by the engine code units without traceability. Now let's see how we can implement the pattern in our own application. In the video How do I use the journal template batch line pattern, we created an entry table based on a resource journal. Let's use this journal to see how the entries are created. This entry table uses the journal pattern to be created and has an auditability via register table. Let's open code unit 50003, example journal post, which creates the entry. There are a few important pieces to highlight. The first is the mechanism to create an entry number. This is a standard pattern that has to be used to avoid gaps in the numbering. If having gaps in the numbering is not a problem, the auto-increment property can be implemented, but using this limits us from implementing registers. The registers are kept for each set of journals that we post. The first journal line creates a register, and each new line updates the 2 entry number field. The last part of the code unit moves the data from the journal to the entries. Please note that at this point there is never any business logic. This is for performance reasons. All business logic should be executed at either the journal, line or document level. As the last part of this video, I would like to point to the entry tables that use the auto-increment to create the entry numbers. They are the reservation entry, change log entry and job queue log entry. Each of these use the auto-increment property. Dynamics NAV uses the SQL identity insert to increment the number. From CAL, the number is only available after the real insert has been done. Please note that the built-in mechanism for budget and capacity does not use this SQL identity insert, but something built into the C-side engine. In this video we have learned how to use the entries pattern. We have looked at how it's used from a functional perspective and how it's implemented in the standard application. Lastly, we created our own entries in our example database and looked at the auto-increment property. Thank you for watching. I'm looking forward to seeing you again in another episode of the How Do I video series for design patterns in Microsoft Dynamics NAV 2015.